Great. So again, a huge welcome to this virtual table. And this session, The People versus Climate Change, Advancing Climate Justice Through the Courts, is really about the role of climate litigation, and particularly community-driven lawsuits against governments and corporations in bringing about just climate action and the kinds of systemic change that we need to secure our collective future. So in a moment, we'll hear from several speakers who are involved in climate litigation in different parts of the world, including one woman who is party to a pending lawsuit in front of the European Court of Human Rights. And they'll share some insights into how climate change is an intersectional human rights issue, the role of lawsuits both in stopping the destruction wrought by fossil fuel corporations and agro-industrial companies, and in achieving climate solutions and social justice, and the crucial importance of ensuring that communities are really fully engaged in the litigation process, because court cases are never about just what happens in the courtroom, but as much about the mobilization around and outside of the courtroom too. So our speakers will provide a bit of an overview of the rapidly evolving universe of what really qualifies as climate litigation, and talk about different ways that the law is being leveraged for change, as well as some of the challenges that we're encountering in bringing those suits and trying to induce that kind of systemic change. I will, before turning it over, we're going to start with a very short video, and then I will turn over the talking stick, as it were, to my colleague Alejandra Serra. I will just briefly introduce myself first. My name is Nikki Reich, and I work at the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL, I'm based in Washington, D.C. CIEL has offices there and in Geneva. And CIEL has been working for over 30 years at the intersection of environment and human rights, using the power of law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. And in terms of our climate work, we've really been seeking to use the law to hold corporations and governments accountable for their impacts on climate change, and to hold companies accountable for what they knew, when they knew it, and what they did or didn't do about it. We're also working to shift financing out of fossil fuels to stop the money pipeline that's bankrolling climate destruction, to support communities resisting new oil, gas, and petrochemical production, and to ensure that human rights are central to climate solutions. And while we work to use the law to achieve climate justice, when the law deviates from justice, as it so often does, we also work to change the law and improve the law by pushing the frontier of legal norms and their interpretation, so that the law reflects the links between human rights and climate change and recognizes the right to a healthy environment. And I'll return a little bit later to talk about some of the research and advocacy that CIEL has done in terms of climate litigation support. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and share my screen and play a very short, less than 2-minute video. So bear with me. I hope that this works without any issue. I will, before doing so, I will just make sure that I drop in the chat the link to the slides that we're using, so that anyone who needs to follow along separately can do so here. And then I will go ahead and share. Okay, is everyone seeing a slide there with the title of the session? Great, thank you for confirming. Okay. So we will go ahead and get started with this very short video.
It was the strongest typhoon ever known. I lost both my parents, my eldest brother, my sister-in-law, and my 3-year-old brother.
You will be placed under arrest on the charge of disorderly conduct.
I'm just a youth. I'm just standing here with my small voice to this big corporation.
So I'm going to turn it over now to Alejandra Serra, who's an associate legal counsel in Greenpeace International's Climate Justice and Liability Program, to talk about some of the major breakthroughs in the last decade that have influenced climate litigation trends, including growing awareness of climate change as a human rights issue and some of the many cases in which Greenpeace is involved. Alejandra?
I don't hear you. I hear nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was still muted. Okay, so thank you, Nikki. And as she said, my name is Alejandra Serra, and I work as an associate legal counsel at Greenpeace International. I am also a Colombian lawyer, and I am originally from Colombia. So I actually decided to become a lawyer because I believe that law is, I still do, I believe the law is one of the best tools we have to create long-lasting change in our societies. So every species, including our own, can thrive. Today, I want to talk to you about how climate change is a human rights issue and the role that communities have in achieving climate solutions and social justice around the world through climate litigation. Next slide, Nikki, please. So first, I will briefly talk about two major breakthroughs of the past decade that have influenced climate litigation trends. The first one is the publication of the 2018 IPCC report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5. This report showed us that limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times would dramatically reduce the climate impacts for people and the planet. And it also showed us that any temperature rise beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius would have catastrophic and irreversible effects in our climate system. Scientists estimate that we have reached 1.1 degrees and that we will reach 1.5 between 2030 and 2052. So clearly we are running out of time. And to stay within safe temperature limits, we need urgent and rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The second breakthrough that I want to talk to you about today is the Climate Accountability Institute's research on carbon measures. This 2013 study showed us that nearly 2/3 of the carbon dioxide emitted since the 1750s can be traced to the 90 largest fossil fuel and cement producers, most of which still operate today. So the fossil fuel industry can no longer claim that everyone is responsible for climate change, therefore no one can be held accountable. On the contrary, we have now enough evidence to affirm that the fossil fuel is the most significant, the fossil fuel industry, is the most significant contributor to today's climate crisis, which is affecting the human rights of millions around the world. The Climate Accountability Institute regularly publishes updates to the data, so I invite you all to go to their website and learn more about this. Next slide, Nikki, please. So this leads me to the second point of my presentation. Climate change is a human rights issue. Even at 1.1 degrees of global warming, climate change impacts are falling disproportionately on populations which are disadvantaged due to poverty, gender, age, disability, geographic location, and cultural or ethnic background. Next slide. Think about the island and coastal communities experiencing more frequent and intense tropical storms, or the forest fires that are affecting indigenous peoples and communities around the world, or the climate-induced heat waves affecting the elderly and people with disabilities. One thing is very clear: climate change is the biggest injustice of our generation. But luckily, many NGOs and communities around the world are realizing something very important, that when people come together, they are powerful, and that together we can make a change. So all over the world, people are turning to the courts demanding the protection of their human rights. Lawyers and NGOs are beginning to understand the importance of collaborating with communities to transform their stories into robust initiatives capable of achieving climate change, systemic change, So they are not victims we serve, but leaders, agents of change we stand beside. Some communities are suing their governments for failing to protect them from environmental harm and the impacts of climate change. Others are filing complaints against corporations responsible for the climate crisis that is violating their human rights. So now I will give you two examples of people-powered climate cases and how they are bringing change into this narrative. So first I want to take you to Mexico. Nikki, next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2020, with the support of several NGOs, including Greenpeace Mexico, a group of Baja California Sur residents sued the government for developing a federal energy program that would intensify the use of fossil fuels for energy production in the region, worsening air pollution and climate change. Official air quality reports have shown that the amount of pollutants coming from the operation of energy plants in Baja California Sur exceeds the authorized limits, and that this is affecting people's health. Nevertheless, Mexico's government keeps investing in an energy model that is based on fossil fuels. So residents of Baja California Sur fear that this energy program will further violate their human rights to health, to a healthy environment, and to sustainable development. So they are asking the administrative district court of Baja California Sur to order the government to develop a federal energy program that promotes renewable energy programs and that ensures access to clean energy. And as part of that same strategy, and to challenge the federal energy program from a different front, Greenpeace Mexico filed another lawsuit in Mexico City against the government for using resources that were intended for climate change mitigation into a program that is clearly promoting the use of fossil fuels. Greenpeace Mexico claimed that the federal energy program was violating the rights to a healthy environment of Mexicans, and that it was jeopardizing Mexico's compliance with its international climate commitments. In September last year, the Second Administrative District Court of Mexico City granted a provisional suspension of the program. The main hearing is now pending, but for now, authorities must abstain from promoting it, which is great. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second case I want to talk to you about takes place in the Philippines. So as many of you might know, in 2013, the super typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, causing great economic damage, over 7,000 deaths, and over 4 million people displaced. Due to human-induced climate change, typhoons and intensity have dramatically increased, becoming one of the biggest threats that Filipinos face today. In 2015, a group of Filipino citizens and NGOs, including Greenpeace Philippines, submitted a petition before the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, seeking an investigation into the responsibility of the world's largest carbon polluters in the human rights violations resulting from the impacts of climate change in the Philippines. A climate change that they knowingly caused with their activities. During the course of the Commission's national inquiry, people told the stories freely, taking back power from corporations that have contributed to the harms that they are suffering. A final resolution of that inquiry is expected to be released this year. Earlier today, my wonderful colleague, Jasmina Paurak-Tawano, legal advisor for Greenpeace Philippines, provided a detailed overview of the case. So if you missed it, I really encourage you to look at the recording of the session and to go to their webpage and social media to learn more about this groundbreaking case. Next slide, Nikki. Thank you. So these two cases are only like two examples of many, which we could spend hours talking about. But for now, I would like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Our generation is the last one that can take steps to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And to any lawyer or law student here with us today, I would like to invite you to be aware and to raise awareness of this moral responsibility in our work. No matter the field you're at, we can all contribute to change. Next slide. Thank you. So if you want to learn more about climate litigation, particularly on how to hold governments accountable for their climate inaction, I invite you to consult this guide that was produced by Greenpeace Philippines, and it's called Holding Your Government Accountable for Climate Change, a People's Guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ale. And I'm now going to turn it over to Elizabeth Stern, who's a member of Klimaseniorinnen a Swiss organization that has brought a lawsuit challenging the inadequacy of the Swiss government's climate policy, and is currently involved in a lawsuit pending before the European Court of Human Rights. I will turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. So now you see all these courageous women. So our complaint is about the right to life and health, which is part of the Swiss Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights. So we are arguing that Switzerland is violating the human rights of older women with its inadequate climate policy, because climate change has a significant impact on the health and mortality of older women. Now, during heat waves, they suffer from dehydration, cardiovascular problems, respiratory problems, higher blood pressure, hyperthermia. So this overheating of the body can lead to heat cramps and heat strokes. Physiologically, women's bodies deal worse with the heat than men. Men can take about 6 degrees more heat than women. Men sweat more than women and transport the heat out. Now, during the summer, we have 35 to 37 degrees. Now, when I was a child, when there were 3 days of 30 degrees in a row, that was very rare in Switzerland, school was out. Now imagine, now we have 35 to 37 degrees for several weeks. Now my body cannot deal with this heat. Some of the plaintiffs do not dare to leave their house during heat waves. They close the shutters. They do not even turn on the light, stay in the dark and gloom until the day is endured. And then they hope for the night to bring some relief. This is not normal for Switzerland. And although Switzerland has signed the Paris Agreement, the climate policy we have does in no way ensure the agreed upon limit of 1.5 degrees in global warming. But the Federal Supreme Court, this is our highest court in Switzerland, has rejected our complaint, arguing, now listen, this argument, that older women's rights to life and health is not affected with sufficient intensity at the present time, because the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming has not yet been reached. Now, I say, what a strange argument, particularly in a country like Switzerland that invests so much in the prevention of snow avalanches and rock slides. I ask, why not in the prevention of climate change? After the rejection by our Federal Supreme Court, we climate seniors, as a group of then 1,600 women, plus 4 individual plaintiffs, we took the case to the European Court for Human Rights. We Klimaseniorinnen hope that this court will take an in-depth approach to assessing Switzerland's duty to protect our health and lives from the negative impact of global warming. Now, in the meantime, in March of this year, the European Court for Human Rights has accepted our complaint that we presented last October, giving the case priority status. By the way, there is another picture where we are. Can you show the next slide, whoever did that so nicely for me? The next one. Yes, isn't this great? So these buildings in the background, that's the European Court for Human Rights. And in front are some of us. Not many of us could travel to Strasbourg because of COVID. Now, the court has called on Switzerland to submit an official response to the complaint by mid-July. We consider this a breakthrough step. Our complaint is, by the way, the second climate case only that will be heard by the European Court of Human Rights. The other case from a group of young persons from Portugal also has been given priority status. Now, our ultimate goal is that Switzerland greatly improves, accelerates the process of climate protection, that the Swiss government plans on much stricter, more ambitious climate goals. We want our government to implement a climate plan that guarantees the required 1.5 degrees limits on global warming. And we want the European Court for Human Rights to acknowledge the link between human rights and climate issues. Now, let me say also a few words about my commitment. I was asked to talk about that. In the 1980s, I was in the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement. I also worked to end hunger. I was not modest. And in the environmental movement beginning in 1990, when I worked and lived for 2 years in Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa, and saw the disastrous effect climate change had there already on the land of the local small-scale farmers. Talk about climate justice. There was none, no justice at all, nor political, nor ecologically. It haunted me when I was back again in my safe, wealthy, and climate-ignorant home country. So I took a job in a small private green venture capital company funding sustainable projects in Europe and West Africa. Now, after 8 years of very hard work, we failed bitterly. However, I did remain an activist in environmental groups up to now, 30 years later, with the Senior Women for Climate Protection Switzerland. When I heard about the Klimaseniorinnen, I could not believe that you could actually take the state, your own government, to court for not keeping its word. How can I say this? Having grown up in a highly democratic country like Switzerland, it seemed so dramatic a step to me, and at the same time so logical, just, and terribly inspiring. I felt this is the leverage, and so I became a member of this audacious group of older women who are also my age cohort. Now, we were turned down by our own court 3 times. That is hard to swallow, particularly because of the reasonings given. And then our realization that basic rights are put last in the climate crisis. In general, the whole process meant a lot of just waiting for the courts to answer. That was nerve-wracking. It was good to be part of a group, not alone, and to have Greenpeace as a very supportive organization on our side, backing us up. The process started with the first court in 2016. Now we have 2021, and the suspense is still high on what will be the final decision. If the European Court for Human Rights does decide in our favor, then their decision is binding for the Swiss government. It will have to comply with it. And the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe will monitor the implementation of the court's judgment. Now, a final word. There's nothing new. We in the North and West are the main polluters, and it is my generation, foremost the so-called baby boomers, who plundered this planet's resources. I do feel the responsibility to do my share in stopping this plundering, restoring the land. Did you ever hear the joke about those 2 small planets that met up in space? One of them looked terribly ill, so the other one asked, "What's the matter? Are you sick?" "Yes, I have Homo sapiens." And the other said, "Oh dear, don't worry, it will pass soon." I'm not a cynic, so I don't want this to happen. I want to convince, to persuade people to invest into our survival. Last Friday, I heard the engaging talk by George Marshall on why our brain is wired to ignore climate change. Among many inspiring things, he said that what motivates people are not facts, but stories. So I try to tell you the story of a group of old women still going strong, the senior women for climate protection Switzerland, and our unceasing commitment to all of our survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for listening. And that really was beautiful, as someone was saying in the chat. And we will definitely come back to, there have been some questions and comments along, so please feel free to keep them coming in the chat, and we're going to open it up for discussion in just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at the moment and come back to the group and turn the talking stick over to Puven Mudli, a human rights lawyer, social justice activist, and the executive director of Natural Justice, which is a human rights and environmental justice organization rooted in the struggles of communities in Africa, who's going to talk to us a bit about experiences with climate litigation across the African continent, different types of ways that legal challenges are being brought to stop destructive activities, to force action on climate change, and to address the needs of those communities most affected. So Puven, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and yeah, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Elizabeth, thanks so much for sharing that story. It's very inspirational. And as you were speaking and thinking through, Alejandra, your earlier points around why climate change is a human rights issue. The bottom line is we are in the 6th mass extinction event, and if we're talking about a right to life, then we're talking about a human right. If we're talking about the right to dignity, then we're talking about a human right. And if we're talking about a right to dignity or life, that's not a future event. It's definitely linked to what's happening now, and certainly the ecocide that's going on. So for me, one of the key things is often when we think about climate litigation, thinking about in some ways, our head goes immediately to the way we've been taught, which is a very siloed way of doing things. So if we talk about climate change, then we're talking about climate experts, we're talking about climate something, and it takes away from the interconnectivity. And that's one of the biggest challenges, all of us are realizing at the moment is, once you disconnect things, we end up in the situation we end up in now. So for me, how did I get involved in this work? I grew up next to a coal-fired factory during apartheid in South Africa. And 40% of the kids, including myself, got breathing problems. So every breath I take, it takes me back to what's happening on the planet now. So, when people are struggling to breathe in cities across the globe, I mean, that is our reality. It's not a future reality. So the big question is, why are people turning to courts? I think part of it is the realization that the planet is unraveling at quite an accelerated speed. There isn't time to waste. I think partly it's desperation as well, because people have lost faith in governments and lost trust in government. And certainly with financial institutions and multinational companies. So in many ways, communities are seeing this as, not like in Africa, courts at some point used to be the last kind of resort. But now it kind of feels like the only resort, that, the only kind of positive victory is possibly going to come from court, other than, overthrowing a government or some type of revolution. So increasingly, communities in Africa are looking to the courts because, they don't know where else to look. And a key part, Olivia, when one of your words around accountability on the chat is this question of, how does one hold governments to account? And again, increasingly people are going to court to do that. As we know, and the special rapporteur on on the environment, has been doing a lot of work similarly, natural justice and a range of organizations looking at the right to a healthy environment, across over 120 constitutions. But often, that's only in a constitution, and it requires people actively challenging governments to ensure that that fundamental right is met. Similarly, governments have committed to a range of different types of agreements, including Paris and other types of agreements. But the reality on this continent is, many government leaders and other types of leaders, will speak about net zero, will speak about their commitment, etc. But the question is, what is the reality? And the reality, and I'm just painting this based on the communities we work with in Africa as natural justice, is we are currently in court or in a legal process in South Africa against and South Africa, one of these emitters in the world, around massive oil and gas exploration. We're in court in East Africa with a few other organizations around a Total oil pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania. Many of you would have heard the Okavango Delta threat both in Namibia and Botswana because of a Canadian company that's been given permission to essentially suck out the the oil and gas that's underneath this, one of the most biodiverse areas, and the area where one of the first peoples, the San communities, live in both Botswana and Namibia. So on the one hand, you have governments making promises and commitments, but the reality is during COVID, or especially during COVID, many things stopped. People were forced to stay indoors, but companies were being given licenses to extract across this continent. So, as I say, often communities now see the courts as kind of the, in many ways, the last resort. My colleague Gino yesterday, together with a group of others, spoke about the Lamu victory in Kenya. And that's really a good example of how different parts of a strategy have come together, because going to court is one thing and one part. But I think having a kind of comprehensive strategy where, on the one hand, you have a legal process, on the other hand, people from the range of communities that are being impacted, they know the law, they understand the law, they're able to shape the law, but also they themselves are able to challenge governments and companies. And the Lamu example is a good one of, where people organized themselves, where people understood what their rights were, and then people eventually went to court, because ultimately, and that was a successful case where this would have been the first coal plant and operation in East Africa. And it was a kind of David and Goliath struggle, because a small community essentially beat off massive financial backing from a range of countries, including China, including the African Development Bank, and so on. So, just one example. And what happens is, that gives other communities major hope. So, and as you get one victory after the next, it kind of sets these precedents, which we see have happened globally, from the cases in Colombia, India, the US, New Zealand, and so on. And similarly, cases are now happening in Africa. And those precedents that will be set will eventually, I think, get us to a point where, in terms of remedies, courts looking at climate more in depth, taking it more seriously, looking at compensation, loss and damage, alternative kind of pathways. And ultimately, this question, and some in the chat, Dan the Plan, Alexander, Annette, spoke about their word being ecocide. And ultimately, it is that accountability that's critical. and that's something we have to continue pushing for. Several other things I'd like to speak about, but given the time, I'd rather have a question and answer and discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Puven. And thanks to all who are throwing a great many different questions into the chat. And we're going to come to those in just one moment. I was just going to say a couple things to kind of take a step back and put some of these different examples in a little bit of a broader context, and then really turn it over to the questions. And I'll read some of those that I've been gathering in the chat out and really invite anyone to voice, elaborate if they want to, and any of the speakers to respond. And also just to say, we do apologize that there isn't translation of this session. We weren't able to organize it in time, but we really do welcome if you're understanding me in English and us in English, but you would like to ask a question in Spanish. I know there are Spanish speakers who would be able to hear it and translate it for you, and also French speakers as well. I don't know if we have other languages represented, but we are certainly happy to do that, maybe German as well. But I wanted to just share my screen one more time, just to make a couple additional points before opening it up. So I just wanted to say that these examples of cases against both governments and corporations are part of a really rising tide of climate litigation around the world. And these are a few graphs from different reports, including a report by the United Nations Environment Program, as well as the Saving Climate Center, just showing the explosion in the number of cases from 884 cases in 24 countries in 2017 to over 1,500 cases in 38 different countries in 2020. While the cases are still dominated by litigation in the United States, what we see is a growing number of cases in a wider number of countries, and a greater diversity of the types of cases that are being brought. And on that note, in terms of what we've really seen, and some of the panelists have spoken about, is a strong rights turn. What's been called a rights turn in climate litigation is really the rise in the number of cases that are based on human rights and constitutional rights, challenging government action, and increasingly challenging corporate action or inaction on the basis of human rights. As there's been really the emergence of a global political and scientific consensus that climate change threatens human rights, and that protecting against dangerous levels of global warming and the mounting impacts that are already being experienced requires dramatic action, that it actually compels, under existing human rights obligations and constitutional obligations that enshrine those rights, compels states to take action. They have a duty to protect human rights, and corporations have a responsibility to respect those rights, and under domestic law, not to cause foreseeable harm. And communities are increasingly turning not only to national courts, but to regional courts and other human rights bodies before the United Nations. Different human rights treaty bodies that enforce the implementation of human rights treaties are being asked to pronounce what the law requires, that the law requires action to halt the drivers of climate change and to take clear action to solve the impacts with attention to those communities that are most disproportionately affected. And as we heard just now from Puven and others, a lot of the cases that we're seeing grow in number are cases challenging the known drivers of climate change. The greatest, as Ali alluded to with the study on the carbon majors, we know that fossil fuels are responsible for the vast majority of anthropogenic climate change, and that the carbon majors, the companies, the fossil fuel and cement companies that have released the emissions, have known for over 6 decades of what those contributions to climate change are. And so we're seeing a growing number of communities who are resisting and challenging new fossil fuel projects and new deforestation activities driven by agro-industry in particular, and trying to bring law to bear on scrutinizing the climate impacts of supply chains. And if you, I recognize the chart is too small to read, but this is just to give an idea that one of the other major categories of cases that is growing in number, that is very active in the United States and increasingly around the world, are cases against fossil fuel companies brought by cities and states as well as communities increasingly. And this is really what motivated the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, the inquiry into the responsibility of the carbon majors that Ale mentioned, that Greenpeace Southeast Asia has led on, that we have known, and CL has contributed along with other organizations and investigative journalists to research exposing the legal and evidentiary basis for holding big oil accountable, making polluters pay, exposing what the oil companies knew about the contribution of their products to climate change, when they knew it, and what they did or didn't do about it. And we know that in the past, since the 1960s, the oil companies have known about the contribution of their products to climate change, and for many years sought to obscure that and deny that science, to influence and delay regulation and change. And now we're seeing a new generation of deceit on the part of those companies of trying to pass off their ongoing production of fossil fuels as somehow climate compatible, Paris aligned, or net zero. And there's a growing interest in using the law to expose the contradictions and the incompatibility of continued fossil fuel production with the obligation to avoid foreseeable harm. And these are harms that are not only foreseeable, but foreseen now, that there's no question that there is no more space in the global climate and that there is no more ability to withstand an increase in fossil fuel production that will lock in those polluting technologies. And so it is actually incompatible with duties of care that these companies hold and with state responsibilities under international human rights law to authorize these operations. And so why are people turning to the courts? We've heard a bit about this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and return to the discussion and call out some of the questions. We've heard a bit about why people are turning to the courts, what those courts are being asked to do, what kind of remedies are being sought, and what success looks like both inside and outside the courtroom. I just wanted to highlight a few of the challenges that are being encountered in those cases, and then really call out some of the questions and open it up for discussion. And a few of those challenges, as we've seen, accessing the courts is one of the biggest challenges, and both in terms of who has resources to bring a case and who can actually bring a claim, who has standing to do so, and how do people show that they're uniquely affected in a way that give them a right to bring a lawsuit. Some countries make it easier than others to challenge government action or inaction. But there's also another dimension of accessing and using the courts is about the safety and security of those who do. We've seen a really increasing crackdown and repression against civil rights, human rights, environmental justice defenders. We've seen violent repression of people who speak out against powerful interests. And this is a huge concern. And so one of the things that, if we're thinking strategically, transnationally about supporting one another, is both using cases to highlight and increase international attention and exposure to issues as a way to protect people, but also knowing when it's not possible for certain people to put themselves in the spotlight and how other cases can do so. One of the other challenges that we see is that the courts are really a poor mechanism for distributing justice. The court cases that are ongoing are not evenly distributed around the world, and courts alone can't mete out justice that will reach all those communities most in need. And so we as a community need to continue to work and think of creative solutions, think of creative remedies that we are asking for in court cases so that those remedies extend beyond just the community or the plaintiffs who are involved in that case, but have a farther reach and we're able to amplify and expand them. We also have seen in a number of cases, governments push back and courts say that these are political questions. These are issues that are too big of a problem for courts or that should be left to the legislature. But as the climate science and the consensus around what is needed to avoid dangerous climate change and protect human rights become clearer, there's less of a gray area in terms of what action is needed. It's clear that current levels of ambition are grossly insufficient and that the consequences for continuing the activities that drive climate change are untenable for human futures, human life, and human rights. As those of you who may have seen in December, the new climate emissions reduction plans submitted by countries around the world, some 75 countries that submitted their commitments even if those commitments were delivered, they fall so far below what is needed, something like 1% of reduction in emissions below 2010 levels, when what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says is needed is a reduction of 45% below. So we are grossly off the mark. If there's any gray area, we're not in it. This is a black and white issue now that we don't have to get lost in the shuffle. We know that changing business as usual is necessary. And the last thing I'll flag is really just about the challenge of evidence, of bringing evidence to court to prove the harm and to induce change. The science is definitely improving about being able to link climate impacts to causes and to link incidents of climate harm. But there are challenges because there are still parts of the world that remain data deserts. And we know we treasure what we measure, and we need to ensure that there are ways to harness traditional knowledge of indigenous communities and local communities who can document the changes they're seeing and bring that to bear in lawsuits. So there are a number of different questions in the chat, and I wanted to call out some of them and then just open it to others. There are some questions that have been asked about what panelists think about ecocide and the efforts to make ecocide a crime or harm to the climate into a crime, and what impact that might have. There are also questions about legal strategies for challenging financial institutions, corporations, pension funds, institutional investors that continue to invest in fossil fuels, and how that squares with the desire to focus on human rights and climate justice. There are also some questions about whether there's possibility for legal attacks on the Energy Charter Treaty. I'm sure there are a few others and folks can help, but I'll pause and invite any of the other panelists first and then open it up if anyone wants to come back on a particular question or point.
Maybe I would like to say something on how difficult it is to prove harm. For instance, the first court in Switzerland turned us down because they said that the harm that's being done to older women is not sufficient. And anyway, they argued, we are not really complaining about our own affliction, but we would like to have the environmental problem solved in general and not just focused on us, which was also a very strange argument. So yes, indeed, you have to have a lot of epidemiological data so that in our case, for instance, that we could prove harm, and that in itself is just very, very time consuming and expensive. Taking the government to court or a corporation is a question of money. That it's not democratic. You just need a lot of money for that. And the reason why we could do it is simply because one of the older women died and left a legacy, is that the right word? Left a legacy to us, stipulating that it should be used for Strasbourg. And Strasbourg is the city where the European Court for Human Rights is located. Otherwise, we could, I don't know how we would have done it. That's just sheer luck, sheer luck.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Ale, did you want to come in?
Yes, actually, I would like to address one of the questions. I think it was Chiara who made it. So she asked about our views on the potential legal strategies of using financial arguments to shape the priorities of corporations, pension funds, and other institutional investors. And actually, I have been reading a lot about it lately because I feel that there is a lot of potential. And I think that litigation will come in this area, especially if we consider that young people right now, like myself, are starting to contribute to pension funds that might not have any viable future. I'm lucky enough to work for an organization that actually invests on a green pension fund, but that is not the case for many. So I think that, I mean, it is clear, right, that pension funds are not assessing the climate risk of permanent investment impairment, of capital losses. They're not being transparent. So I believe that for future litigation, it will be crucial to bring human rights claims into the center of that litigation, for instance, by showing that pension funds are investing in activities that are harming human rights, like fossil fuels, and that therefore they are violating their business duties to respect human rights in their activities. So I do think that there is a lot of potential, and hopefully we will see a litigation case soon.
Yes.
If I can just add on that, I wanted to just say this is an area in which CL is doing a lot of work looking at both exposing and understanding of what fiduciary duty requires. So the obligations of those who are responsible for investing funds, particularly retirement funds, but in general, investing others' money, to think about both the duties of prudence and of loyalty and a whole host of other legal duties. And so there is an ongoing effort to actually argue and build cases to contend that continuing to invest in fossil fuels is incompatible with existing fiduciary duties. It is no longer prudent. It is not. Does not accord with the duty of loyalty and impartiality between present and future beneficiaries, given the obligations of those investors, and that there is at a minimum a duty to monitor and evaluate the prudence of investing in fossil fuels, and that there's really a strong case to be made now that fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry is in long-term structural decline. Oil and gas does not have a future. It is in its death throes. And that, investing, especially for the long term in that sector, is at odds with the duties required of fiduciaries, as well as a gross contribution to ongoing environmental and human rights harm. And so it is really interesting that there are both efforts to use extant law, existing law under the fiduciary realm that binds investors and banking institutions, as well as ideas about bringing claims based on tort duties, other common law duties, duties of care, or human rights informed duties against those financial institutions, because to argue that money is complicity, bankrolling, the impacts, bankrolling activities that have known and foreseeable harmful impacts is not compatible with those. I know there are a lot of other questions in the chat, and I'm sure we obviously won't be able to get in a lot of other good suggestions. There were some questions about ecocide and The Hague. There were questions about legal attacks on the Energy Charter Treaty. There were also questions about agricultural and pesticides. I don't know, Puvan, if you wanted to come in on any of those.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. A couple of things. I think just on the ecocide one, there's actually a lot of behind the scenes work happening by human rights and environmental lawyers across the globe, looking at some of the legal definitions, looking at some of the international courts, and really starting to push on that front. So just to say there is a lot of work going on at the moment by a range of lawyers. On the one of the questions from Ume from Turkey, just on the question of human rights and then kind of rights of nature, just to say that, I mean, there's a lot of cases now that are looking at rights of nature, and some cases, the interconnection between human rights and the rights of nature. So there was a really good case that many of you would know from Colombia, the Futures case, that looked at the intersection between people's rights and the rights of nature. And if you look at contexts like in Africa, it would be right now really difficult to argue, the rights of nature, because, basically in terms of the situation, but also how things are perceived, it's almost like governments and others would use it as a strategy to say, but what about people's rights, as opposed to looking at it as the interconnectedness between people and nature. And a lot of the work we do is that kind of intersection, but there's more and more precedents now that deals with the rights of nature, and there's many cases that are kind of now well documented around that. Just on the legal argument side, I saw a question around this. Often going to court is also, it's about strategy and tactics. Part of it is kind of like a threat. to try and push for some other resolution, obviously before going to court. But also, even once one goes to court, sometimes it's just arguing around the process. Often it may not even be the content in the initial stages, but it's just using the law to stop harm from happening immediately and doing whatever it takes to stop that harm even before getting into some of the more, kind of substantive questions. And that's, often that's really helped a lot to stop something from happening at that point. And then, if it continues, then, getting into the kind of merits of some of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Pooven, and thanks all. I know we are at time and I don't want to cut into people's evenings or days or whatever time it might be for you, and also the closing plenary. I did just want to acknowledge, I know we didn't get to everything, particularly the questions about the efforts to create, to enact a criminal statutes that make harm to the environment a crime and ecocide. And I do think that there's a lot of work going on both at the domestic level in France and elsewhere, as well as at the international level, efforts to amend the Rome Statute or to get the International Criminal Court to recognize ecocide as a type of crime against humanity or an additional crime that would be subject to the jurisdiction of the court. And those efforts, I think, are really important, not just symbolically, but also because the threat of criminal sanction and the opprobrium, the moral opprobrium that comes with a criminal act is a very powerful deterrent and can personalize the risk of liability in a way that we've found it challenging to do to date, but there's ongoing efforts to really hold directors and officers of companies that are perpetrating ongoing environmental harm to be subjected to personal liability. So it's a very important development that many are working on and that will continue to be a piece of the prong in the multi-pronged approach to advancing climate justice. Thanks for everyone really for joining, and please do, I posted in the chat links to different organizations' websites where we do have more information, including information about the links that someone alluded to between pesticides and fossil fuels, and CL has done a lot of work really looking at fossil fuels and the links between the fossil fuel industry, plastics, pesticides, and many of the similar tactics used by this industry. So please do reach out to any one of us individually, and we really hope to stay connected and invite your questions and dialogue in the future. Thank you all for joining. Thanks very much to all of the speakers for your contributions. And we look forward to seeing you at the plenary, figuratively, and in our work and movement going forward.
Thank you. Thank you and bye-bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a nice evening. Yes.
Thank you so much, guys. Well done.